Are you passionate about foreign policy, national security, and the latest in domestic politics? Consider becoming a member of the DSR Network, your go-to source for in-depth analysis and insightful discussions. With the DSR Network podcasts, stay ahead of the curve on global affairs. Each episode features top experts, policymakers, and thought leaders who break down complex issues into digestible, engaging conversations. From breaking news to historical context, we cover the topics that matter most. Whether it's the intricacies of international diplomacy, the latest in national security strategies, or the dynamics of U.S. politics, the DSR Network has you covered. Members receive an ad-free listening experience, bonus content for virtually all of our shows, an invitation to join the DSR Slack community, enhanced show notes for select podcasts, and much more. Visit thedsrnetwork.com/buy and enter code GRADUATE to receive 30% off the regular membership price for the first year or first month. That's thedsrnetwork.com/buy and code GRADUATE. Thank you very much for your support.
This is the Daily Blast from the New Republic, produced and presented by the DSR Network. I'm your host, Greg Sargent. In recent days, the level of MAGA deception seems to have truly gone nuclear, and at the center of it all is President Biden's age. Fox News' Sean Hannity floated a strange new theory about Biden's upcoming debate with Donald Trump. Republicans dishonestly sliced and diced numerous videos to make Biden look befuddled, diminished, and senile. And we learned that the Sinclair media apparatus is blaring out all that deception to huge audiences nationally. Today we're trying to make sense of all this with well-known writer and podcaster Thom Hartmann, author of a New Republic piece called From the Border to Bump Stocks, the MAGA Lie Machine is Heating Up. It argues we're close to a tipping point of MAGA mendacity that will make this election look like no other. Welcome, Tom.
Hey, Greg. Thanks for having me.
So let's go through what we've seen recently. Sean Hannity has been hinting at a bizarre theory that Biden will be drugged up at the debate with Trump in late June. He recently said this.
He's going to be all hyped up, hyper-caffeinated, whatever it is. It's interesting that 70% of the country does like the idea of drug testing.
We also had absurdly doctored videos. One deceptively made it look like Biden wandered off, another that he froze up and had to be led off stage by Barack Obama. This isn't just fringe agitprop. It's the work of the Republican National Committee and Rupert Murdoch's media empire, which has spread this stuff relentlessly. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, it's like when you've got nothing to offer the people, then you have to BS them. This is the majority of Americans would like to have a national healthcare system that works. I mean, literally, you can do the polling. The majority of Americans would like to have free college and end student debt. The majority of Americans would like to have a $15 minimum wage. The majority of Americans would like to have our government do something about climate change. The majority of Americans would like to see billionaires paying more than 3.4% income taxes. I mean, the list goes on. I can give you a list of 20 or 30 of them. But none of those things are happening because Republicans are blocking all of them. The Republican governing agenda seems to be, let's make Donald Trump a dictator and see what happens. So when you've got a governing agenda that absolutely sucks, that nobody in their right mind would vote for, but you've got to get people to come out and vote for you, what's your alternative? Well, you lie to people. You lie to them about what your governing agenda is, and the Republicans, by and large, are not even bothering to do this anymore. Or you lie to them about your opponent and try to make your opponent seem so old and feeble and dysfunctional and evil and corrupt that people will either vote for you or, in many cases, simply not show up to vote. A lot of these attacks on Biden kind of fall into two buckets. One is they have been telling their own people for so long, for 3.5 years now, that Biden is feeble and incompetent and incontinent and everything else, that when he shows up, like at the State of the Union address, they're like, holy cow, he must be on drugs. And so they've got this kind of a face-saving thing, but then also they're trying to amplify that message that without pharmaceuticals, he wouldn't be able to do it.
Right. I mean, the brazenness of all this is really a big part of the story. Sinclair Media is putting this stuff in countless quote-unquote news stories at outlets across the country. And as Judd Legum showed, in some cases, they're literally linking to deceptively edited Republican propaganda right in the stories. I mean, is the brazenness really something new? Or I think you had mentioned you didn't think that we had seen anything quite like this since the 40s. So I do think that we saw some of this kind of stuff pretty significantly during the George W. Bush years, Iraq war propaganda, Karl Rove, and so forth. What's your case that this is something new?
This is not, Greg, a new strategy. It's just a new strategy to this generation of Americans. Back in the 1930s, Franklin Roosevelt, or actually I think it was the 1940 election, Franklin Roosevelt was getting hit with all these lies from the Republican Party. They were saying that he wanted to jump into World War II, which might or might not have been true, but that he was, he had all these secret plans and all this stuff. And he gave a speech in which he said, essentially, that the Republicans have imported into this political campaign a strategy that Adolf Hitler developed. That the strategy is very straightforward. It has two parts. Number one, never tell a small lie, always tell a big one, because by its very fantastic nature, people will assume it has to be true. And then secondly, repeat it over and over and over again, and it will become true. It's just what Goebbels said. Goebbels said, a falsehood repeated becomes a truth. And here's a clip of it if you want to hear it.
The opposition in this year has already imported into this campaign a very interesting thing because it's fun. They have imported the propaganda technique invented by the dictators abroad.
So I think that this is, to bring this back, I think that what's happened is that we've got a Republican Party that in some ways resembles that of the late 1930s. Rachel Maddow's done just a marvelous job with her writing and her podcasts of laying out these Republicans who were literally taking cash money from Adolf Hitler, and in exchange for putting Nazi written speeches into the congressional record and things like that. There's a book my father gave me. He was a book collector. He gave it to me for my birthday when I was 30. It's by Rex Stout, and it's called The Illustrious Dunderheads, and which is like almost impossible to find now. I mean, it's worth a small fortune, but it's a collection of speeches that were given on the floor of the United States House of Representatives and the Senate by Republicans, talking about how we can do business with Hitler. Hitler's not that bad. Really, we should consider some of his ideas. This fascist stuff, we can work with this. And I think that, that got shattered by World War II. The whole Republican embrace of Hitler and Mussolini just got shattered by World War II. And, it's been bouncing around since then, the John Birch Society in the 50s and 60s and 70s and whatnot. But now it's back in full force. Only this time it's, rather than supporting a German dictator, it's supporting a Russian dictator, and being funded in large part and helped through media by a Russian dictator.
I want to bring up something about the fascism debate, as it's kind of called derisively by people who deny that what we're seeing is fascism. And one thing that does seem to me to be a kind of fascistic politics, I think undeniably, is the way the kind of MAGA deception is really an expression of power, right? You really see Trump lying brazenly and MAGA propagandists lying brazenly for the purpose of essentially declaring to their supporters that they can do this. Don't you think? I mean, that seems like a kind of fascistic politics that I don't know if, I think we sort of had some of it under George W. Bush for sure. I mean, one could argue that those lies were maybe more consequential. I just wonder if they're not quite the same in nature as what we're seeing now.
I was horrified when Bush, in fact, it was, I've been doing my radio program for 21 years now on Sirius XM and a couple hundred radio stations. And we started it in 2003 because of Bush and the war. And I wrote an op-ed that became the original business plan for America Radio and all that kind of stuff. And I was horrified by Bush's lies. And we all, not we all knew that they were lies, but many of us did. And how they were doubling down on them and the human toll. And then you get, James Ho and these other guys writing the torture memos and just humiliating, destroying America's reputation around the world with Guantanamo and all this torture and stuff. And I thought, it can't get better. It can't get worse than this. I mean, but it has. I mean, we're way beyond that stuff. George W. Bush, was perfectly willing to help arguably steal an election in 2000, but at least he still sort of believed in democracy. This is a whole different thing. These people are not talking about politics. They're not using politics. They're not even making political arguments by and large. In fact, my bet is that when the debate happens and they try to get Trump to talk about issues, he's going to turn every question into an ad hominem attack on Joe Biden and try to put him on the defense.
One thing you get out in your piece that does seem at least somewhat new is the sheer scope and reach of the right-wing media network. You wrote that there are over 1,500 right-wing and 800 religious radio stations and hundreds of right-wing TV stations. How do we visualize just how big that is?
This is a real challenge to our democracy that these folks are. And I think this is the really important point that needs to be made, is that they're not arguing policy. They're not arguing politics. They're arguing system of government. That's the debate that the Republicans are having with us right now. And I think most Democrats don't realize it. I think most Americans don't realize it, that they're actually saying, we want to fundamentally alter the system of government in the United States. We want to shift to something that we've never seen before in this country. This is not, they would love to get rid of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and the 17th and 19th Amendments, and basically take us back to 1860. But this is not that. This is not just that. This is taking us. Well, I think you could argue that it is that, because what they're trying to take us back to is the Confederacy. Starting in the 1820s, because of the invention of the cotton gin, Eli Whitney's invention, one machine could do the work of 50 enslaved people cleaning cotton, which was the most time-consuming part of producing cotton. And the wealthy plantation owners in the South were able to afford purchasing these machines. And as a result, over about a 30-year period from 1820 to around 1850, this oligarchy rose up in the South, and they turned the South into a complete police state. There was no opposition politicians. White people who dared to oppose the political power of the Southern oligarchs were routinely lynched. I mean, there's entire books written about this. The South had ceased to be a democracy altogether. And one of the reasons that they attacked the North was not just because the North was not allowing slavery, but because the North was an example of democracy that they could no longer tolerate. And so I think in some ways what you're watching right now is an attempt to return to those values of the Confederacy, essentially. And then you look at how, Trump just gave a speech about how we need to bring back the statues, the Confederate general statues and things. I mean, that didn't come out of nowhere. This is their project, is revive the Confederacy. They don't use that kind of language. It'll be a new and improved version of the Confederacy, a brand new police state. But that's what they want.
You could even argue that when Trump demands that the big oil interests raise $1 billion for him and dangles very specific promises in front of their noses in exchange for that, or I should say, we don't know for sure if it was a quid pro quo directly, but it sure sounded like one. That's that's oligarchic stuff very clearly. I want to ask you about something else. I've been thinking about the fact that for many of these local outlets, the right-wing message is a kind of hyper-nationalized one. You can drive through eastern Ohio and the Mahoning Valley and hear a right-wing radio host ranting about how stupid AOC is and how heroic Texas Governor Greg Abbott is in battling the federal government over the border. Both of those are hundreds of miles from eastern Ohio. Do you think this is part of the crisis of local news? Red, rural, small-town America being relentlessly fed a kind of top-down script, a top-down regimen of lies and deceptions about national Democrats, that being the diet?
Yeah, absolutely. There was a coincidence of events, not by coincidence, but coinciding events in the 1980s. Reagan blowing up the fairness doctrine, setting aside the equal time rule, and fast-tracking Rupert Murdoch's citizenship so that he could own television stations in the United States. And then Rush Limbaugh rolling out his show. All those things happened within 2 years of each other. And this goes back to the Powell memo. Lewis Powell was a tobacco lawyer in Virginia who Richard Nixon put on the Supreme Court in 1972. And so in 71, Powell had written a memo for his next-door neighbor, Eugene Sindor, who was the CEO of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce at the time. And it was basically, after getting pretty badly beat up by Franklin Roosevelt, most business people just kind of got out of politics in the late 30s. I mean, the Great Depression had just hurt the image of big business to begin with. And so even by the 70s, businesses were largely apolitical and business people were just keeping their nose down and doing their job. And Lewis Powell said, it's time for us to get active. We've got to turn into a political force. And one of the things that he recommended was basically creating a media infrastructure. And that's what happened in the 80s. And I sat in the office of a United States senator with a billionaire who owned 900 radio stations. And this was about eight years ago, maybe. And the billionaire had just bought these stations, had just acquired them. He had bought a network, he and his brother. And the senator, who was a regular on my radio program for 11 years, said, Tom does pretty good. He's been beating Rush Limbaugh in the arbitrons, all over the country. Why don't you put his show on, or why don't you put some progressive programming on? You've got 400 stations running right-wing talk radio all day long. And this guy says, I will never put anybody on the air who wants to raise my taxes, who advocates raising my taxes.
That brings up something I wanted to talk to you about, which is the Democratic side of the information imbalance that we've got here. There's a bizarre argument out there that Dems shouldn't bother trying to get the MSM to stop obsessing over Biden's age. Dems shouldn't really bother battling against all the fake videos. Instead, they should go directly at the age question, argue that Biden's age doesn't render him unfit for the presidency. I'm sympathetic to that thought, but it also strikes me as naive about the state of our information environment. Isn't this the bottom line? Democratic arguments just aren't going to reach a lot of these low-propensity voters. And meanwhile, all this misinformation in the form of these doctored videos and stuff just does kind of seep into the orbit of those voters. So Dems do have to try to choke off that misinformation, don't they? I mean, is there an answer here?
I don't know how they're going to do it, but I think Mark Twain was right when he said a lie will get halfway around the world before the truth gets its boots on. And this is kind of where we started the conversation, Craig, is, that is the Republican Party's strategy this fall, is tell a lot of lies, whether it's lying about policy or lying about people or lying about their past or, fill in the blank. And how you deal with lies when the media won't deal with lies is really troubling. I mean, some of the headlines that have been coming out of the Washington Post and the New York Times lately that just completely ignore reality, that repeat Republican memes as if they're true, and they may debunk them in the article, maybe in the 14th paragraph.
Right.
But this is a crime against journalism and democracy, in my opinion.
I agree, Tom. I want to say that this is what I'm talking about when I say that we can't be naive about the state of the information environment. Right. Look, these headlines, people sort of say, sometimes snark on Twitter, oh, you're battling over a New York Times headline, LOL. But those headlines really do shape how local news talks about things across the country. And so we do have to really try to contest those. It's kind of hand-to-hand combat, I guess, but And it's like the crush of it is relentless, and it takes a lot of effort to get a New York Times headline changed. But I don't see an alternative. Do you?
I don't. I think that it now falls to us, and by us I mean the general public, not podcasters, hosts, and whatnot. That it falls to us to essentially hold our media accountable. I mean, Sinclair is squealing right now in public because Judd Legum called him out, and what, or actually not because he called him out, but because the mainstream media picked up his calling him out. And that we need more of that. We need more of just average people going in and commenting. Very often both papers, the Post and the Times, allow comments, and those comments can be scathing. But we need to be giving feedback to these people and telling them that we would like to have our democracy preserved. And then you get the publisher or one of the senior editors, I guess, of the New York Times saying, well, it's not our job to protect democracy. Our job is to report the news. Yes, it is your job to protect democracy.
Well, where does that leave the average reader? You said they have a role. What can they do? What people listening to this probably agree with us about the state of the current information environment. What's the most productive thing all these people who are ingesting this kind of fire hose of information day in and day out can do?
Yeah. The people in the media are people just like all the rest of us. I've worked, I've written for and worked for newspapers and magazines over the years, and they get wounded or injured emotionally, just like everybody else, by a slap, as it were, and they take things seriously, generally speaking. I think that the more the public can express outrage when the media, and I would include in this in a huge way the Sunday talk shows that let Republicans just blather lies after lie after lie. By reaching out, you can email virtually all of these organizations. You're not going to, the CEO isn't going to read your email. It's going to start out with an intern probably, but still, you can do it. You can mail them letters. You can, if you have a subscription to the publications and they allow comments on their articles, you can comment on it. You can call into talk shows. You can write letters to the editor of your local newspaper if you still have one. You can call your local right-wing, hate radio station and get in a battle with the host if they'll let you. Increasingly, they won't even let progressives call in. But we're not without agency. We just don't have the bazookas. We don't have the billionaires and the giant, 100,000 watt sticks that the right wing has right now, because they got smart about this in the 80s. And Democrats, and I've been yelling at Democrats about this forever. When we had Air America in 1980, in 2007, I think it was, or 2008, a bunch of us who were Air America hosts went to Washington, D.C., and Bernie Sanders set this up and did a presentation to about 25 members of Congress. There were 6 or 7 senators there, and the rest were members from the House. And, our pitch was, we're on 54 radio stations and in every major market in the United States, but we're leasing these stations from Clear Channel, which is a very dangerous and precarious thing. You guys need to talk to your donors about buying some stations because, instead of just dumping $1 billion in every election cycle. And Hillary Clinton responded by saying, this is really the job of the free market. This is not something that we should be bothering with. And just, collapsed the whole meeting essentially. And it's like Democrats have never figured out that if you own the media infrastructure, you own American public opinion to a large extent. And then of course what happened was when Mitt Romney decided he was going to run for president, his company Bain Capital bought Clear Channel, and over the course of the next year, they flipped every single one of our stations to sports and took us off the air.
Yeah, I think the sum total of what you're saying, and this is something that both Democrats and ordinary news consumers need to internalize, is that the first step is to recognize that we're in an information war. Anyway, Tom Hartman, this is super informative stuff. Great piece. We really appreciate you coming on with us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Greg. Thanks so much for inviting.
You've been listening to The Daily Blast with me, your host, Greg Sargent. The Daily Blast is a New Republic podcast and is produced by Riley Fessler on the DSR Network.